Hello, my name is Dr. Jonathan Howard, and I'm going to give a presentation titled Things Dr. Marty Makary Said. Dr. Marty Makary is the nomination to run the FDA, and I hope that this presentation will be useful to anyone who just wants to understand about who might be running our public health agencies in 2025, as well as to any journalists who may be writing about Dr. Makary or have the opportunity to ask him questions. I think it's important to know what he said. And let me just start off with something that I agree with that he said. He said, it's okay to have an incorrect scientific hypothesis, but when new data proves it wrong, you have to adapt. I totally agree. So let me just remind people a little bit of COVID's timeline. There's at least 3 or 4 dates that are important for what I'm going to talk about. The first of these is December 2020. That's when vaccinations started. And we have to remember that the spring and winter of 2021 were very optimistic times when we thought the vaccines were, perfect and cases were falling. And it was a very optimistic time before any variants rolled around. But some of us were worried about those variants at that time. And then we have to remember July and August 2021, when the Delta wave really ripped through much of the country, especially the southern states, impacting unvaccinated people and a lot of young people like previous variants hadn't. And then very soon after that, in December 2021, in January 2022, the Omicron variant arrived, and this had a much greater potential for reinfections. And because it was so contagious, it impacted children more than any other variant. During the peak of the Omicron wave in January 2022, just under 7,000 children were sent to the hospital in a single week. Just a little bit about me. I'm a doctor. I'm a neurologist and psychiatrist here in New York City. I'm not speaking as part of any institution. I'm just speaking as my own today. But I worked in Bellevue Hospital throughout the pandemic, and I always describe my experience there by saying I didn't do a lot other than just be nice to sick, dying people. But I saw a lot. I saw more people die in the spring of 2020 than I had my entire career combined. I saw several young people die. The youngest person I saw die was a healthy 23-year-old. I saw that people could be severely injured by COVID if it, even if it didn't kill them. And I think I gained a respect for what the virus could do when it was left to spread uncontrolled. And none of my experience was unique. Millions of people experienced the same thing. I also was a mini expert in the anti-vaccine movement when the pandemic arrived. I had a quirky interest in it, and in 2018, along with law professor Dory Reese, wrote a book chapter for a book called Pseudoscience titled The Anti-Vaccine Movement, A Litany of Fallacy and Errors. So suffice it to say, I was very prepared when the pandemic arrived to recognize and counter anti-vaccine arguments. And I wrote about all of this in a non-best-selling book called We Want Them Infected, how the failed quest for herd immunity led doctors to embrace the anti-vaccine movement and blinded Americans to the threat of COVID-19. And many pages of it, like the one pictured here, were just quotations from doctors. And Dr. Marty Makary was a star of 3 chapters. Chapter 1 was failed predictions of herd immunity. Chapter 2 was how doctors and he often mocked people who tried to avoid COVID and spoke about COVID avoidance as anxiety, as fearful, almost as a mental illness. And you'll hear a lot of that coming up. And then he was a star in the section of the anti-vaccine movement. So let me just read from this one page of it, because it's a very sort of typical quote from Dr. Makary and typical of my writing, which is really just me collecting things. Anyways, on May 21st, 2021, he said, COVID cases are collapsing in front of our eyes. Daily cases are now 1/10 the number of daily flu cases in the middle of a mild flu season, with a now identical case fatality rate. Projections for the coming weeks and months are even more favorable. That's because roughly 80 to 85% of adults are now immune, more than 6 in 10 adults are now vaccinated, and more than half of unvaccinated adults have natural immunity from prior infection. In public health, when a virus has trouble jumping around because more than 8 in 10 adults in the community are blocking its transmission, we call that herd immunity, yet some people want the pandemic to stretch out longer. No one wanted the pandemic to stretch out longer. And just this is why I told you about the timeline at the beginning. Remember that just 2 to 3 months after this, the Delta wave ravished many parts of the country. And 6 months after this, the Omicron variant ravished many parts of the country. A little bit more about Dr. Marty Makary. This is from his biography on his Johns Hopkins webpage. He is a surgeon and public policy researcher at Johns Hopkins University. He writes for the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, is the author of 2 New York Times best-selling books, Unaccountable and The Price We Pay. Dr. Makary served in leadership at the World Health Organization Patient Safety Program and has been elected to the National Academy of Medicine. Clinically, Dr. Makary is the chief of islet transplantation surgery at Johns Hopkins, is the recipient of the Nobility in Science Award from the National Pancreas Foundation, and has been a visiting professor at over 25 medical schools. He has published over 250 peer-reviewed scientific articles and has served on several editorial boards. So, very impressive doctor, very impressive credentials. He was famous for or infamous, I should say, before the pandemic, for creating this myth that medical errors are the top 3 cause of death in the United States behind heart disease and cancer. This is one of those things that just doesn't even pass the sniff test. If this would true, it would mean something like half of the people who die in hospitals die because of medical error, which is absurd. And this was debunked very thoroughly before the pandemic by, of all people, Dr. Vinay Prasad, who used to be reliable. He wrote, "Don't believe what you read on the new report of medical error deaths." He said, "The new estimate of 251, 454 deaths matters because the sensational figure is imprecise and may be wrong by a large magnitude. The renewed attention on medical errors in hospitals might be good, prompting doctors to take it more seriously. But it could be harmful if it scares some people away from getting the care they need. It could also lead overzealous, out-of-touch hospital managers into constructing painful bureaucratic solutions to the problem of medical errors that ultimately don't help." During the pandemic, Dr. Makary became a pandemic celebrity. He advised Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia. He testified before Congress, as you can see there. So he often wrote and spoke about the medical establishment as if he was not part of the medical establishment, when in fact he very much is part of the medical establishment. He is the definition of the medical establishment. He is a professor of surgery at a prestigious medical school who advised governors and senators and congressmen, and as we will see, was a ubiquitous media presence. This is how he became chosen or nominated to run the FDA, because he was famous. He was a celebrity part of the medical establishment. He was the number 2 doctor on this article, The Dishonest Doctors, who were Fox News's most frequent medical guests in 2021. This was compiled by Media Matters, and I strongly suggest that you read his entry. He has 142 appearances in 2021 alone. You can also hire him to speak, apparently, and he gets a pretty good fee, $20,000 to $30,000 for an in-person talk, or $10,000 to $15,000 for a virtual talk. If anyone wants to hire me, by the way, I usually charge a donut or a cookie. That's about it. He also has ties to pharmaceutical industries. There's this company, Harrow.com, which makes medications for eye diseases, and sitting on its board of directors is Dr. Marty Makary. So anyone who is concerned about the revolving door between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry should know that Dr. Makary has this connection. So let's review some of the things that he said um, many of his very, very poor predictions. Let's take a listen. This is from February 2021.
First, let's go to Dr. Marty Makary, who is also a Fox News medical contributor. Doctor, great to see you. You say in this piece that it's time to be honest about what is happening really with COVID in America. What do you mean by that?
Well, Martha, I think any scientist has to look at a 75% reduction in cases over the last 6 weeks and ask what's happening, because it cannot be explained by the vaccines. It cannot be explained by a sudden change in behavior. Herd immunity is not binary, Martha. It's not an all or nothing thing. And as more people get infected and as there's more natural immunity out there, there are fewer people left who are susceptible. And what we're seeing is that herd immunity has already kicked in. It's on a slope to be at very low levels of infection by April, and we add to that vaccinated immunity, we're about to see a very steep decline, and I think it's important to plan accordingly.
So you point out, and there was a UK study done on this, that one of the biggest mistakes here has been the vast underestimation of the number of Americans who've had it, because people see that 29 million, 28 million cases in America. You think that number is too low by how much?
Well, first of all, you're right. People are looking at the trackers and saying 28 million, and that's the number of people with infection. But that's only confirmed, and we've only been confirming about 1 in 4 to 1 in 10 cases. And if you live in a community where everyone has access and they get anxious and they run out and get tested, you might think, well, that most people are getting tested. Most Americans don't live like that. Most people have had major barriers to testing, and that 28 million cumulative total, it probably represents 1 in 6.5 actual infections out there. We know from the UK now and from European studies that even if you never had symptoms, you felt great the entire time, but were close to someone or exposed, or you live with somebody who had it, your T cells, which are very good immune cells, have been activated. And looking at antibodies does not capture activated T cells. There are more people with activated T cells than there are with antibodies.
All right, so let's hear some more about T cells and natural immunity, also from February 2021.
Well, first of all, I think most scientists are well-intended. I've just had some personal conversations with folks who've said, don't put this out there in public because then people might not get the vaccine or they might stop taking precautions. But I think we need to be honest. And there's a 76% reduction in daily cases, Dana, over the last 6 weeks. You, as a scientist, have to ask why. And we cannot explain that by vaccinated immunity. We can't explain it by a sudden change in behavior. It's natural immunity, and it's now over 50% of the population. The reason we've sort of underestimated that prevalence is that we've relied on these antibody tests that look at how many people in society have immunity, looking at antibodies. But it's not just the antibodies, it's the T cells that develop memory. It's these memory T cells that get activated. And a study from Sweden's Karolinska Institute found that you're far more likely to have those activated T cells than you are to have the antibody. A study affirmed in Europe looking at people who were exposed to a family member who had COVID. And even though they had no symptoms whatsoever, they had activated T cells. And that's why UK scientists, the BMJ, just said we've underestimated T cell immunity.
All right, Doctor,
and I think that's why we're seeing a reduction.
I saw the headline this morning. We were all like, hey, this is great news. I've been watching the reaction online. I mean, you're getting a lot of pushback. A lot of people in the medical community say this is wishful thinking. Your words, as of this week, 15% of Americans have received the vaccine. The figure is rising fast. That will increase over time, but we're not there yet. So if you think COVID's gone by April, and so many are still waiting for the vaccine, how can you justify that?
Well, first of all, I don't think it'll be gone. I think we'll be at very low levels of infection by April. I mean, extremely low levels. And that's just based on the slope
I'm just
of the
trying
rate
to get
of
this
decline.
right now.
We've got to explain it.
Got it, Doc. Sorry. At the current trajectory, I expect COVID will be mostly gone by April. Those are your words. Continue.
That's right. Look at the rate of decline. So we've got about half the country, I estimate 55% based on the sampling capture rate of tested confirmed cases. About 55% of the country has natural immunity. Now add to that vaccinated immunity. 15% of the country by the...
All right, so there we go. He was referencing this article. We'll have herd immunity by April, which was published February 2021. He suggested experts weren't being honest with the public, which is a very big theme of his, and I should add that's the theme of the sequel to We Want Them Infected, hopefully coming out early 2025. I digress. He wrote at the time, experts should level with the public about the good news. Some medical experts privately agreed with my prediction that there may be very little COVID-19 by April, but suggested that I not talk publicly about herd immunity because people might become complacent and fail to take precautions or might decline the vaccine. He followed that up with this article. Herd immunity is near despite Fauci's denial. This is from March 2021. He wrote, Anthony Fauci has been saying that the country needs to vaccinate 70 to 85% of the population to reach herd immunity from COVID-19. But he inexplicably ignores natural immunity. If you account for previous infections, herd immunity is likely close at hand. He followed this up with a couple articles in May 2021. This article, risk of COVID is now very low. It's time to stop living in fear. This is what I read from earlier. He said COVID-19 cases are collapsing in front of our eyes, yet some people want the pandemic to stretch out longer. I mean, what a thing to say. No one wanted the pandemic to stretch out longer. He also wrote this article in May 2021. Don't buy the fear-mongering. The COVID-19 threat is waning. And he said, on a clinical level, we simply have not seen significant reinfections at any concerning rate. The public health threat is now defanged. And I should add, by the way, please go read these articles yourself. It's just full of this sort of thing, and I want everyone to know that I'm not taking anything out of context. So please go read the full articles for yourself. He wrote this in an article in June 2021, The Power of Natural Immunity. And he said, the good news about the US pandemic is even better than you've heard. Some 80 to 85% of American adults are immune to the virus. More than 64% have received at least one vaccine dose. And of those who haven't, roughly half have natural immunity from prior infection. There's ample scientific evidence that natural immunity is effective, durable, and public health leaders should pay it heed. So let's talk a little bit about the power of natural immunity, because the power of natural immunity is that it killed 1.2 million Americans, including tens of thousands of young adults and several thousand children. It injured millions more, and this all would have been much worse had people lived entirely without fear of COVID. And I should add, graveyards are full of young people who did live their lives without fear. And this was the unfortunate result. So natural immunity is powerful, just not in the way Dr. Makary was describing. So having predicted herd immunity in April, in May 2021, Dr. Makary went on to say that he was right. In this little clip, he is going to say that public health leaders are talking about total eradication, and that's not true. No reasonable person was talking about total COVID eradication or total risk elimination in May 2021. But just listen to how he describes public health officials as being dishonest and trying to manipulate the public for doubting that herd immunity had arrived at this time.
You said in your op-ed, Dr. Makary, that maybe we shouldn't buy into all this talk about the variants.
That's right. Look, we've had dozens of variants, and they're all entirely encompassed by the vaccine and preventing serious outcomes. So we got to be careful right now and not scare people. People need something to look forward to. And if you look at the numbers, we're doing really well right now, Trace.
Yeah, we are doing well. And what's your thing? I mean, you talked about this a couple of months ago. You said, look, we are 2 months away from herd immunity. Are we there? Are we getting closer? Is it ever going to be fully realized in your estimation?
Well, unfortunately, we have this perception now that's being created by some public health leaders that we need to reach total eradication. And we're not going to get to total absolute risk elimination. That's a false goal. And quite honestly, it's being used now to manipulate the public. We heard today again from our public health leaders that if we get to 70% vaccination, then we could start seeing restrictions. But that's dishonest. Most of the country is at herd immunity. Other parts will get there later this month. San Francisco had 12 cases yesterday, Joyce, most asymptomatic. What do you call that? I call that herd immunity.
And Dr. Makary spread this message on Z-Dog's show, Dr. Zubin Damania, in May 2021. And I just want to call a little bit of attention to here to the, kind of the maturity level that he displays when he's minimizing COVID this way. Keep in mind, the virus had killed about 600,000 Americans by this point, and would go on to kill 600,000 more. But here he is spreading, well, you'll just hear it for yourself.
You ignore natural immunity, which some people, I'm not going to say who, but some people have been doing, and Dr. Walensky, by not talking about it. Let me know, email me, or let me know if you ever hear our nation's public health leaders talk about natural immunity. It's half of the population, and it's half of the unvaccinated population, which is why 80 to 85% of adults today have immunity. And we shouldn't be chasing after eradication.
Yeah, this is crazy. COVID zero. There are people on there going, we should get to COVID zero because New Zealand did it. It's like New Zealand had the good grace to be in the southern hemisphere, be geographically isolated, and able to shut down before they had significant community spread.
Yeah.
Great for New Zealand.
We've been moving the goalposts so much. It's one of the reasons why people are not trusting public health officials anymore. So we basically are at herd immunity right now, right? We have 1/10 the number of daily cases of a mild flu season. In a mild flu season, we'll have about 400,000 cases a day. We're at about 25,000 cases a day. We're below 1/10 the number of daily cases as the flu, and the same case fatality rate. In the past, it wasn't. COVID was much more dangerous.
Right.
Now it's the same because it's in younger people.
What Marty is saying, all right, is that now the cases are low enough that they're actually less than what you typically get in a flu season. Now everyone will say, well, but wait, the flu's less deadly on a case-per-case basis than COVID, except that that's not necessarily true anymore because case fatality, infection fatality rates, depending on what you're looking at, change based on, number one, how good you are at treating it. Number two, the vulnerability of the population that's getting infected. And now, because we've vaccinated most of our elders or they've already had COVID, we have now shifted to younger people getting infected. So even when you see cases, they're less likely to die, which means the infection fatality and case fatality rate drop. Does that make sense? So that's the in-depth, and it just got my finger off the button for a second.
And that case fatality rate's 1.3 per 10,000 with flu.
Yeah.
And with COVID, it's 1.1 to 1.4 per 10,000.
Currently, yeah.
So I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but over the past 3 years or so, COVID has killed about 10 times more people than the flu. Someone have to fact check me on this. But COVID is much more, especially in the past few years, much more dangerous than the flu. And one reason that it's not killing as many people as before is not herd immunity, but something called mortality displacement, which essentially means that people can only die once. And COVID has killed 1.2 million Americans who were by definition vulnerable to it, and they're no longer here for the virus to kill. What about when the Delta variant arrived? Did Dr. Makary change his tune about the power of natural immunity and how upset he was that public health leaders weren't glorifying it and honoring the power of natural immunity the way that he was? Let's listen.
That's right. One of the biggest failures of our medical leadership has been ignoring natural immunity. It's about half of the unvaccinated, and they have a reasonable reason not to get the vaccine right now. They already have immunity. Many of them have circulating antibodies, and some of us doctors recommend one shot in those folks if they want to get a vaccine. But they've already got immunity. Now, there's two parts to immunity. One is the antibodies, but the other is the memory B cells and T cells. And that's probably what gives you decades of protection against severe illness. So COVID is going to turn into a seasonal virus that'll cause common cold-like symptoms, and that's going to be our future. We can't try to eliminate this with more restrictions.
And there are some people's cards that actually say that their shot expires within 6 months. I mean, are some of these shots good for a year or longer? Do we know? Do they tell us?
Immunity is probably lifelong. That's what many of us think. Certainly, the test of natural immunity over 19 months is showing that it's going strong and it's durable. Vaccinated immunity, we have suggestions now from Israel that it may start to wane 6 months and 9 months into it. There's an early group now that's been shown to be more likely to get the infection, but less likely to have any severe illness, and you're still protected against death.
All right, so immunity is lifelong in decades of illness. He also gave this interview, which I think is from June 2021. Dr. Marty Makary pans fear-mongering over Delta variant, says more masking orders are overkill. And he said, if you're one of the 99+% of kids that are unvaccinated, those kids don't need to worry. For most people right now, Delta is downgraded to a mild seasonal virus that causes mild cold-like symptoms. The vaccines have been perfectly consistent against all of the variants. And he continued to just glorify natural immunity and say that it was better than vaccine immunity, when in fact, vaccine immunity killed, I think, close to zero, maybe a handful of Americans died from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, while natural immunity killed 1.2 million Americans. He's going to say some things in this clip that are actually right and decent, but let's just listen.
On any other day, this would have been the lead of our show tonight. It's that important. Researchers in Israel have just conducted what Bloomberg News described as, quote, the largest real-world analysis comparing natural immunity gained from an earlier infection of COVID to the protection provided by one of the most potent vaccines currently in use, end quote. So what did the researchers find in this unprecedented large study? They found that vaccinated people are 13 times as likely to be infected with COVID compared to people with natural immunity gained from previous COVID infections. Additionally, vaccinated people were 27 times more likely to be symptomatic with COVID as compared to people with natural immunity. So to the question, is natural immunity more effective than the vaccines? It seems that we have an extremely clear answer. Dr. Marty Makary is a Johns Hopkins University professor of public health. He joins us tonight. Doctor, thanks so much for coming on. This is something that you have suggested for an awfully long time, and it looks like now we have proof. Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah, we've had these debates now for 19 months in the medical community, and as we're seeing vaccinated immunity wane over 6 months, it turns out natural immunity is about 19 months into this pandemic. It's effective, it's durable, and it's going strong. And I think a lot of public health officials have been afraid to acknowledge that because they're worried people will just go out there and get the infection and not the vaccine. Look, I want people to get the vaccine. If they're non-immune, I think the vaccine saves lives. But let's be honest with people. The hesitancy with vaccination is because we've not been honest with things. We've not been honest about natural immunity. We've not been honest with the data. We should say complications from the vaccine. They happen, they occur, they're extremely rare, and it favors vaccination over natural immunity. But we got to acknowledge natural immunity is real. This study had 700,000 people in Israel. It affirms 14 other studies. And another one from Israel showed it was 6.7 times natural immunity was over vaccinated immunity. And the reason is you probably get more of an antibody response to the entire surface of the virus, not just the spike protein. And you get a cellular response, that is the B and T cell response, that may be more durable as well.
All right, so using natural immunity to protect yourself against virus. There are many analogies. It's like giving away all of your money so that no one robs you. It's like shaving your hair so that you don't become totally bald, or poking out your eyes so that you never need glasses. I mean, it works, but it kind of defeats the purpose. And the reason that people were suggesting vaccines over the virus isn't that the vaccine created stronger immunity. It's just that it came without the risk of death and severe disability. That's the obvious case everyone was making. It's the obvious case Dr. Makary and Tucker Carlson ignored. Let's hear at least one more clip of him just glorifying natural immunity. But first, let's just recognize this is what the Delta wave did. It caused record deaths in its wake. And then when the Omicron variant arrived, I'm sorry, let me just skip back. Even after that, Dr. Makary continued to glorify natural immunity and say that public health leaders weren't being honest with the public because they didn't, genuflect and praise and bow down to how wonderful and powerful natural immunity was. He wrote this article in September 2021. Natural immunity to COVID is powerful. Policymakers seem afraid to say so. And he said, unfortunately, many elected leaders and public health officials have held on far too long to the hypothesis that natural immunity offers unreliable protection against COVID-19, a contention that is being rapidly debunked by science. So here was this guy who claimed that we'd have herd immunity by April, who claimed in May 2021 that herd immunity had arrived, who claimed that we didn't need to worry about the Delta variant. After the Delta variant ripped through much of the country, is still saying that public health leaders aren't honest because they're not glorifying and just praising the power of natural immunity. Okay, so now, what happened when the Omicron variant arrived? Do you think Dr. Makary said, time out, pause? Boy, I was maybe a little bit wrong about natural immunity. No, he did not. He gave this interview, Dr. Makary on the Kilmeade Show, Omicron fear fueling a second pandemic of lunacy. Makary says Omicron looking more like Omicold based on the data so far. And in this little clip, that's how you're going to hear Dr. Makary talk about the Omicron variant. He's going to call it Omicold in nature's vaccine. Let's listen.
I call it the Omicold because now we have laboratory data that it's not infecting the deep respiratory system. It's staying in the upper respiratory system. We have epidemiological data that it's not driving hospitalizations. We see massive surges in parts of the world with no real change in death rates. By the way, we normally see a surge in respiratory pathogens in the winter. That's normal, but we're just not seeing it translate into the sort of severe illness. And the good news is it's replacing Delta. That's good. Now, I don't want anyone to get sick ever, but Omicron is good news. It is nature's vaccine for those who will never have access to a vaccine. It's displacing a far more dangerous variant, and it gives cross immunity to that more dangerous variant.
Okay, so Omicron was not nature's vaccine. Omicron was not Omicold. This is what the news headlines several months later reported. Hospitalizations of young children with the virus surged during the U.S. Omicron wave. As I said, about 6,500 children were hospitalized during a single week in January 2022, and just under 200 children died. This all would have been much worse had none of them been vaccinated at the time. And Omicron variant wasn't harmless for seniors either, especially those who had been vaccinated when vaccines first came out in the winter of 2021, as this article explains. During the Omicron wave, death rates soared for older people. So this is what Dr. Makary called Omicold and nature's vaccine. And we can just go through the timeline. This is all 2021. February, we'll have herd immunity by April. May, risk of COVID is now very low. It's time to stop living in fear. June, Dr. Makary pans fear-mongering over Delta variant, says more masking orders are overkill. And finally, December, Dr. Makary, Omicron fear fueling a second pandemic of lunacy. So there was nothing that the virus could have possibly done where Dr. Makary would have said, you know what, I was wrong about herd immunity in April. I was wrong about the power of natural immunity. Dr. Makary is unable, or has thus far been unable, to utter those words, I was wrong, even as he accuses public health leaders of lying to the public about the power of natural immunity. He also overhyped vaccines in the spring of 2021. And he and many other like-minded doctors now say, oh, it was such misinformation that people said COVID vaccines prevented transmission, blah, blah, blah. So let's look at some of the things that he said at that time. And, to be fair, This was a very optimistic time. The data from the randomized controlled trials of the COVID vaccines was incredible. It was 95% effective at stopping infections. In the Pfizer and Moderna mRNA trials, there were 40 severe cases of COVID. 39 of them were in the placebo group. So the COVID vaccines, I think, are the greatest medical achievement of my lifetime, if not scientific achievement of my lifetime. They saved millions of lives. They prevented people, great disability. I still suggest them to every single patient. But all of this was brand new. The COVID vaccines just came out in December 2020. The virus had only been around for a year, but we already heard how confident Dr. Makary was, predicting that immunity to it would last a lifetime or decades. And let's look at what he said about the vaccines. This is March 2021. If anyone hears of a person hospitalized or dead from COVID-19 after full vaccination, please let me know. The data show that vaccines confer near perfect protection against death and hospitalization from COVID. Can't we be honest about that? Again, that was true at the time, but it was not a guarantee that it was going to be true a year later. And it wasn't true a year later. And, doctors who I think overhyped vaccines at this time hurt confidence in them. And I certainly didn't do it in the spring of 2021. In his article, COVID Prescription, Get the Vaccine, Wait a Month, Return to Normal from March 2021, he talked about this unpublished study that showed that vaccination reduced transmission by 89 to 94% and almost totally prevented hospitalization and death, according to press reports. Immunity kicks in about 4 weeks after the first vaccine dose. Then you are essentially bulletproof. Again, it didn't work out that way. Unfortunately, I wish it had. In this article, which we've already discussed, the risk of COVID is now very low. It's time to stop living in fear. He said, there has never been a documented case of a fully vaccinated person who is asymptomatic transmitting the virus. And we now know that that's, obviously not the case. With children, he became anti-vaccine, and he also became anti-vaccines for the boosters in adults. Let's talk a little bit about pediatric COVID. The numbers aren't exact, but it hospitalized over 200,000, about 234,000 children, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it killed about 2,000 children. And again, all of this would have been much worse had none of them been vaccinated. And Dr. Makary wrote articles, the CDC's flimsy case to vaccinate children. Here's one of these articles. Think twice before giving the COVID vax to healthy kids. He wrote, in reviewing the medical literature and news reports and in talking to pediatricians across the country, I'm not aware of a single healthy child in the US who has died of COVID-19 to date. This is exactly how anti-vaxxers used to speak about measles. Also, Dr. Makary often promoted this myth. I will show you it's a myth. And he referenced a white paper of his, or he called it a research paper, but it was just a white paper, whatever that means. It's not a scientific publication, but he just analyzed insurance data from some insurance company, Fair Health, and he called it a study of pediatric COVID deaths. I actually read this white paper. It reported on a grand total of 3 deceased children under the age of 18 who had some medical comorbidity. It didn't say exactly what it was. It is true that the vast majority, probably around 75% of children who die of COVID do have underlying medical conditions, but those underlying medical conditions are things like asthma and obesity, very common underlying conditions that they're not healthy, but these kids had decades of life ahead of them. Dr. Makary would often talk about pediatric COVID deaths using the example of leukemia, giving the impression that these were children who were about to die on a Saturday of COVID, when instead, of leukemia, when instead COVID killed them on a Friday, essentially sort of saying, don't worry, it's just just the kids with leukemia who are killed by COVID. But that unfortunately is not the case. And all of these stories were publicly available before Dr. Makary made his claim that he reviewed the medical literature and news reports and couldn't find a single example of a healthy child dying of COVID. And of course, death is not the only bad outcome. And even children with leukemia, their lives have value. The COVID vaccine was studied in a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial for all age groups. This is from the pediatric age group. It was 100%, this is from the adolescent group. This showed that the vaccine was 100% effective in stopping COVID infections. Obviously, it's not the case anymore, but when Dr. Makary was writing these things, this was available. He never mentioned this. He never will. And unsurprisingly, observational studies later showed that the vaccine was extremely effective at preventing rare but grave harms for children. And children died because they didn't get vaccinated. So we shouldn't forget that this all had real world consequences, that this wasn't just some game on Twitter or some game on Fox News, that misinformation by doctors trickled down into the community and it had real world consequences. And let's listen to Dr. Makary, along with Zubin Damania and Vinay Prasad, talking about boosters. This is right before the Omicron wave came around. And, you'll see the maturity level that they bring to this discussion.
He doesn't have a third microphone.
Yeah,
a third microphone.
My supporters fund the show, and they're cheap. They're so cheap. No,
all these resources.
Okay. We're right on each other.
That close, or is this an unboosted contact?
We're unmasked, unboosted, and unrepentant, Marty.
Well, I'm an unboosted male. That's my preferred pronoun, by the way.
Oh, is that your pronoun? Unboosted male?
Yeah.
Yes, my pronouns are it, they, those, and currently unboosted because I got Moderna, which apparently kicks ass.
Yeah.
Like it's a good vaccine.
Yeah.
I'm 48. I don't have a lot of comorbidities. I have some clotting stuff, but I've never clotted. It's just like theoretical 23andMe. Thank you very much. So how about you? You boosted?
You know too much about yourself. It's a HIPAA violation to ask someone if they're.
Never mind. Never mind. You don't have to.
Privacy is dead, my friend.
But
privacy is dead right now.
I do see that people do say that. That's not true. It's not HIPAA. You can, of course, ask anyone their status, but no, I haven't gotten my booster yet. And boosters.
You mean this week you haven't got because you do weekly boosters, I'm sure.
Well,
right?
eventually we're all going to have to keep boosting.
My vaccine card looks like one of those like frequent flyer like coffee cards where they punch the hole. Like I boosted here and boosted here and boosted here, and when I get 10 boosters, Fauci sends me a Fauci bobblehead that says I am the science.
I'm getting my booster sent with the GNC nutrition vitamins.
They have the same evidence.
Yeah. What are the odds we get canceled now with the 3-time canceling incumbents?
I get yelled at for platforming each one of you separately. Now all we need to do is bring Jay Bhattacharya and Monica Gandhi here, and we'll have like the horsemen of the apocalypse, and Twitter will just melt. It will just turn into goo.
Nice.
Yeah. So the booster thing, what is the deal with that, Marty?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everybody forgot that the FDA external experts voted down boosters for everybody by a 16-2 vote just 9 weeks ago, right? And then all of a sudden, there's a variant that came maybe from South Africa, and the immediate first response we have is we got to boost every single adult, even if they had a natural immunity from prior infection. It's almost as if there's no association whatsoever between boosting a young, healthy person and Omicron because we don't have any data on it.
We don't know anything about it, right?
Yeah, we know nothing.
I mean, I think that's the paradox of what they were saying that, we don't know anything about this. At the same time, we have information that changes our booster recommendation. Both those things can't be true. If you have no new information about the variant, you can't change your recommendation. Otherwise, you could have changed it 3 weeks ago, but there's a reason why they voted against it. You want to get into that? Why did they not say a 20-year-old man who doesn't work in healthcare? So they did have an allowance for 18 and up if you worked in healthcare. But if you don't work in healthcare, the committee did not want those people to be boosted 9 weeks ago, as you say.
We're blurring, people say boost people who are over age 65. Yes, definitely At least that'll reduce their risk, right? And by the way, it's important to quantify what that reduction is. It's a tenfold reduction in hospitalization from an already very low risk of hospitalization.
All right, so he just made that up. There was evidence at the time that the booster was helpful. This is from a randomized controlled trial. This was at the time just published in a Pfizer press release, but it was when the Delta variant was active, but it was 95.6 protective against disease, again, in a randomized controlled trial. This data was later published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And multiple studies have since shown that the booster was helpful in limiting severe disease in basically all age groups. But these guys made it a priority to laugh at people who wanted the booster, to mock people who wanted the booster. They were much more concerned that someone might get a sore arm from a vaccine dose that they didn't need than someone might have a cold, dead body from missing a vaccine dose that they did need. Dr. Makary, however, he was very concerned about vaccine side effects, specifically vaccine myocarditis, which occurs in about 1 in 10,000 adolescent males or young men in their 20s almost always after their second vaccine dose. All of the doctors who have treated it and reported on it in the medical literature universally describe it as mild. I mean, there are some people who have lingering symptoms, and I don't want to minimize it, but it's not as bad as death from COVID. And Dr. Makary tweeted this in 2023. He said, "The myth that myocarditis was more common after COVID than after the vax was propagated by the medical establishment." Again, he is the medical establishment. "With poor studies of vax-associated myocarditis that had low capture methodology, hundreds of thousands of young people got myocarditis for no good reason." And again, that is just a wildly implausible number. The rate of vaccine myocarditis, as I said, is about 1 in 10,000. So something like 1 billion young people would have to get vaccinated for there to be hundreds of thousands of young people, 1 billion young men. So it just doesn't even, pass the sniff test. And a very reliable doctor responded to Dr. Marty Makary, Dr. Jeffrey Morris, by saying, "Marty, did you even read the paper? It doesn't estimate incidence at all. It compares the risks of clinical sequelae after myocarditis associated with the vaccine with COVID or neither." And this isn't even the proper comparison, since COVID can cause much more than myocarditis, and COVID myocarditis is much more severe than vaccine myocarditis. It has killed people, and people have needed heart transplants as a result. Dr. Makary also spread myths about masks. This is a tweet from a vaccine advocate and friend, Noah, who said, "Marty Makary spreads severe misinformation and refuses to own up to it." On Saturday, Makary made several tweets alleging that the CDC had lowered speech milestones to hide the harms of masks. He was corrected within an hour by many people, but went on Fox News the next day to double down. So it is true that over the COVID pandemic, the CDC lowered speech milestones, and many people initially interpreted this to be an effective mask, that they were hiding the harm of masks. But in reality, they did this based on a review of the literature, which ended in 2019 before the pandemic. But Dr. Marty Makary blamed masks anyway. Apparently, they time traveled to 2019. Dr. Makary also minimized long COVID repeatedly, the exaggeration of long COVID. Long COVID real but overplayed. Don't believe the Fed's fear-mongering about long COVID. Don't believe anyone but me, the guy who's telling you we had herd immunity in April. And perhaps this is the worst thing that he has done. He has legitimized Robert Kennedy Jr., who is America's #1 source of anti-vaccine disinformation. And he told the world that RFK Jr. was normal that RFK Jr. was trustworthy. The man already had a body count of 83 dead children from measles in Samoa. But let's listen to Marty Makary from 2023 not only tell the world that RFK Jr. is right, but that he is right about the rankest, grossest anti-vaccine misinformation that COVID is causing young children to suddenly die. Let's take a listen, and then we'll go over what the truth is, which isn't this.
Dr. Makary joins us now. You watched RFK yesterday. Could you see a lot of yourself and a lot of the attacks on him?
Well, that's right. He talked about guilt by association, the sort of modern day McCarthyism. He's talked about how asking questions is not allowed. He asked a lot of questions himself. But what's interesting is people really don't criticize the details of what he actually said when it came to the COVID pandemic. He's been a skeptic, and he may have a different opinion, but he wrote a 500-page book on Dr. Fauci and the medical industrial complex. 100% of it was true. He said that the NIH nominee to direct the NIH of President Biden received $200 million from Pfizer for research. 100% true. So he's saying things that people know are true, but they just don't want to hear it.
But still, I mean, you even have an out. If you're a Democrat, well, that was that horrible person named Donald Trump's vaccine. Operation Warp Speed was too rushed. So you have your political out. But still, they're so worried about people saying, I'm concerned about this vaccine. And now people just want to get rid of the people that are front and center. They were offended that RFK is getting his moment in Congress. They wanted to bring him behind closed doors. What does that tell you?
Well, one thing RFK Jr. did is he would post true stories of children who died immediately after the vaccine. These were otherwise healthy children. Social media didn't like that. Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, anyone who even associated with him was censored. And in his hearing yesterday, what I really appreciated, Brian, is when he talked about the so-called toxic polarization of society and how we need to be kind to one another and restore civility. That is a message people are hungry for in the medical community, and I think at large.
It's hard to know where to start with that. Robert Kennedy publishes things that are 100% false, as I will show you. He is not out to restore civility. He is out for revenge. This is just Dr. Marty Makary, successfully, as it turns out, pandering for a political job. So let's review a little bit about his track record. There's this article, RFK Jr. spent years stoking fear and mistrust of vaccines. These people were hurt by his work. When 12-year-old Braden Fahey collapsed during football practice and died, it was just the beginning of his parents' nightmare. Deep in their grief, a few months later, Gina and Patrick Fahey received the news that shocked them to their core. A favorite photo of their beloved son was plastered on the cover of a book that falsely argues COVID-19's caused a spike of deaths among healthy young people. The book, called Cause Unknown, was published by an anti-vaccine group read by RFK Jr., who is now running for president. Kennedy wrote the foreword and promoted the book, tweeting that it details data showing, quote, COVID shots are a crime against humanity. The Fays couldn't understand how Braden's face appeared on the book's cover, or why his name appeared inside it. Braden never received the vaccine. His death in August 2022 was due to a malformed blood vessel in his brain. No one ever contacted them to ask about their son's death or for permission to use the photo. No one asked to confirm the date of his death, which the book misdated by a year. When the Faheys and residents of their town in California tried to contact the publisher and get an author to get Braden and his picture taken out of the book, no one responded. We reached out in every possible way, Gina Fahey told the Associated Press in an emotional interview. We waited months and months to hear back, and nothing. And keep in mind, this is who Dr. Makary said was sharing stories that were 100% true of children dying after getting the COVID vaccine. Let's just end with a quote by Dr. Paul Offit, who said about Makary and his nomination, he's willing to lie to the American public. Why do we think this is someone who should head the FDA? I hope that you found this helpful. I hope that if you are a journalist or someone who's in the position of being able to ask Dr. Makary questions about this, that you do so, that you remind him of things that he said, because I think that that's very important, that we have an honest track record and an honest discussion about what he said and his pandemic record. And I will make further videos for any other doctors who are nominated to positions of prominence. Thanks for listening.